All right, ready for another deep dive?
Let's do it.
This time, we're diving into a world where rebellion has some pretty interesting consequences, especially when it comes to, well, romance.
Oh, this is a good one.
We're talking about dinosaur ants
Sounds exciting.
and our source material. A fascinating academic thesis. Trust me, I was hooked from the first page.
I can't wait to hear this. So, dinosaur ants, huh? What makes them so special?
Well, these ants, or Dinoponera quadriceps to be scientific about it, have a social structure that'll surprise you. Let's just say they throw the whole queen bee idea right out the window.
No queen. So who's running the show?
That's the thing. There's no queen ant in this hive. Instead, they have what's called a gamergate. She's the dominant female, the one who gets to mate and basically keep the colony going.
Interesting. So it's like a queen, but with a different title.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. Any female worker ant could potentially become the gamergate.
Oh, wow. That must create some serious competition.
It does. And that's where things get a little, well, weird. To establish their dominance, these ants have this bizarre ritual called gaster rubbing.
Gaster rubbing. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Imagine this. One ant grabs another by the antenna and starts rubbing her abdomen all over it.
Okay, that's pretty strange. What's the point of that?
It's their way of saying, hey, I'm in charge here. This rubbing helps establish a clear hierarchy within the colony.
So it's like their version of a power struggle, but instead of a handshake, it's an abdomen rub.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And this hierarchy influences everything. It determines which ants get stuck with the dangerous jobs, like foraging for food or defending the nest. And then there are those who get to stay back and take care of the brood.
I'm guessing this all ties back to the whole rebellion equals no sex thing, right?
You got it. The research shows that the lower-ranking ants, the ones who are less likely to become the gamergate, are the ones who take on the riskiest tasks.
Wait, so they're putting themselves in danger even though they have a smaller chance of getting to mate? Why would they do that?
It all comes down to family. Since their chances of reproducing are pretty slim, these ants focus on helping their relatives who share their genes, survive, and pass on those genes.
It's like they're thinking, well, if I can't have babies, at least I can make sure my family's genes get passed on.
Exactly. It's a pretty selfless act, sacrificing their own chance to mate for the good of the family. But I'm sure there are still some ants who try to challenge the system.
I bet there are. So what happens when an ant tries to rebel against the gamergate?
Well, let's just say the colony has a pretty strict way of dealing with rebels. It's called policing. The worker ants are always on the lookout for any eggs that aren't laid by the gamergate, and they'll destroy any they find.
Whoa, they take things seriously. It's like their own internal security force.
Right. And here's where it gets even cooler. The research found that these ants actually become better at policing over time. They learn to tell the difference between the gamergate's eggs and those laid by other ants.
Wow, they're learning and adapting. That's incredible.
It is. Even in the ant world, experience shapes behavior.
Yeah.
And speaking of how experience shapes things, this leads us to another fascinating part of this research. Gene expression.
Ah, now we're getting into the really interesting stuff.
We are. What can you tell us about gene expression and what it reveals about these ants?
Well, think of genes as a blueprint for an organism. Gene expression is like reading and interpreting that blueprint, figuring out which parts are used to build certain traits and behaviors. And get this, researchers have found some really intriguing differences in gene expression between high-ranking and low-ranking ants.
Really? So you're saying their social roles are actually reflected in their genes?
It seems that way. It suggests that their position in the colony's hierarchy isn't just about how they act, it's actually deeply ingrained in their biology.
That's amazing.
Huh.
I'm already fascinated by these ants, and we've barely scratched the surface. What else did the researcher find out about these rebellious creatures?
Well, to learn more about that fascinating world of gene expression and how it shapes these ant societies, you'll have to join us for part 2 of our deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive into these fascinating dinosaur ants.
Last time, we were talking about how an ant's role in the colony can actually affect gene expression.
That's right. And, this thesis goes even further, showing how much the environment affects how they behave, too.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The researcher looked at all sorts of things, like how their nests are structured, how they find food, even how temperature and humidity changes things.
Wow. So it's not just about, who's the boss.
Yeah.
The world outside matters a lot.
Exactly. And one of the coolest things they found was how adaptable these ants are.
Adaptable.
Yeah, like they can live in all kinds of places, beaches, forests, you name it. And depending on where they are, they change up how they search for food. Pretty clever, right?
Makes sense. You got to be flexible to survive out in the wild.
Right. And get this, the researcher actually saw them doing these little scouting trips to, like, check the weather before heading out to forage.
No way, seriously.
Seriously, it's like they're saying, okay, is it safe to go out and grab some snacks?
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
So what kind of snacks are we talking about? What do these ants eat?
Well, they're what's called opportunistic omnivores.
Opportunistic omnivores.
Basically, they're not picky eaters. Live insects are their main thing, but hey, if they find some fruit or seeds, they're not going to say no.
Sounds like a good strategy. Keeps things interesting.
Right. Especially when their environment can change so much. Now, remember those lower ranking ants, the ones we talked about, who do a lot of the foraging?
Yeah, the brave ones.
The researcher used some really cool tech to track them.
Hold on, how do you track tiny ants? Did they, like, put little GPS trackers on them or something?
Uh-huh. Close. They use something called RFID technology.
RFID.
It's like a tiny microchip they attach to each ant, so they could follow all their movements.
That's so cool. So what'd they learn from tracking them?
Well, it pretty much confirmed that the lower-ranking ants do the heavy lifting when it comes to foraging. They're often making...
The nest. Just relaxing and enjoying the feast.
Well, not exactly relaxing. They're busy taking care of the brood, which is super important, right? Remember, they have a better shot at becoming the Gamergate someday.
Oh, right. So they're kind of like investing in the future of the colony
Mm-hmm.
and their own potential offspring, too.
Exactly. But don't think it's all sunshine and childcare for the higher-ranking ants. The researcher also wanted to know how they defend their nests, so they did something interesting.
What do they do?
They put a foreign object near the nest entrance just to see how the ants would react.
My guess is those brave foragers, the lower-ranking ones, were the first to jump into action.
You got it. They were way more likely to confront the intruder and get all defensive.
So not only are they the main food providers, they're also the colony's protectors. Wow, they really do have a lot of responsibility.
They do. And it just adds to the idea that their lower social status might be pushing them to take more risks for the good of their relatives.
Fascinating. These ants are full of surprises.
Hmm.
But, we still haven't really gotten into that gene expression stuff.
Uh-huh.
What did the researcher learn about how genes affect those social roles?
That's where we'll pick up in the final part of our deep dive. What the researcher found out about gene expression is truly remarkable. It'll shed even more light on these complex ant societies, I promise.
Welcome back to our deep dive. It's all about those rebellious dinosaur ants, right?
It is, and we're finally getting to the really juicy stuff, the research on gene expression.
Okay, for those who might have missed the first two parts, remind us, what is gene expression again? And why is it important for understanding these ants?
Sure thing. Think of genes as like a blueprint for an organism. Gene expression is like reading that blueprint and figuring out which parts are actually used to build different traits and behaviors.
I got it. So it's kind of like seeing which parts of the blueprint are highlighted, the ones that really matter.
Exactly. And by studying gene expression, we can see what's going on inside an organism, like at a molecular level. So what did they find out about these ants?
Yeah, what did the researcher discover when they looked at gene expression in these ants?
Well, they took brain samples from ants of different ranks, and guess what? They found some pretty big differences in their gene expression patterns.
Oh, so depending on if they were a high-ranking ant or a low-ranking ant, their genes were actually expressed differently.
Yeah. For example, certain genes that are linked to foraging, going out and finding food and aggression, those were more active in the low-ranking ants.
Well, yeah, that makes sense. If you're the ant out there looking for food and defending the nest, you need those genes to be working overtime.
Right, exactly. And then on the other hand, genes related to taking care of the young, the brood, and reproduction, those were way more active in the higher-ranking ants.
Oh, right, because those are the ones who are closer to becoming the Gamergate and, actually having babies.
Precisely. So basically, their social role is reflected in their genes. It's pretty amazing, their destiny is written in their DNA.
Wow, I never would have guessed it was that deep. Earlier, you talked about how the ants get better at policing over time, recognizing and destroying eggs that aren't laid by the Gamergate. Did the researcher find any connection to genes with this, learning process?
That's a really good question. This particular study didn't look specifically at the genes that control policing and learning.
Oh, okay.
But the fact that these ants can get better at the skill over time, it does suggest that there's got to be some kind of genetic mechanism at play.
Right. It does make you wonder what else is hidden in their genes. waiting to be discovered. So much we still don't know about how their brains work and how their experiences actually shape their genes.
Exactly. This research is just the beginning. It opens up a whole new way to look at the connection between genes, behavior, and social structure. And not just in ants, but maybe even in other animals too.
So what's the biggest takeaway from all this? What can we learn from these ants who, give up their chance to have babies for the good of the colony?
For me, it's that our social roles, they can have a huge impact on us, not just on how we behave, but maybe even on our biology.
Like those roles are much more deeply connected to who we are than we realize.
Yeah. And this research on dinosaur ants, it shows that social structures aren't just like something we made up. They might be woven into the very fabric of life itself. Pretty profound.
Definitely gives you something to think about. We're all part of these complex systems, whether we're ants or humans. And by understanding those systems, well, maybe we can understand ourselves a little bit better too.
Couldn't agree more. That's the beauty of science. It lets us see how everything is connected and uncover truths that can change the way we look at the world.
Well said. And on that note, it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of dinosaur ants. A huge thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this incredible journey.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone. Remember, there's always more to learn out there, so keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never lose that sense of wonder.
Until next time, keep on diving deep.